Since early May, tensions between the Russian Defense Ministry and the Wagner mercenary group, a private company with close ties to President Vladimir Putin, have become increasingly intense. For months, Wagner has played a leading role on the Bakhmut front, although suffering great human costs. In a video showing his anger, boss Wagner Prigozhin walks around several bodies and bluntly criticizes Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerashimov. He threatened to withdraw his forces from Bakhmut if no more ammunition would be provided. According to some analysts, the contradiction between Wagner and the Russian military has existed for a long time, and no matter how deep it is, the Kremlin still needs this group. Two days after the tough statement, Wagner's Prigozhin changed his mind and would not withdraw his group from Bakhmut because he's received a commitment to supply ammunition from the Russian military leadership. Wagner is proving that they are the only Russian unit capable of carrying out large attacks in Bakhmut, despite significant losses. In the history of the Soviet Union and Russia, the regular army's dependence on external units has been popular for a long time. Since the outbreak of conflict in Ukraine in 2014, Wagner has been present in Donbass. For the Kremlin leadership, there are a lot of things on the battlefield that Wagner really does well and effectively. To understand Wagner's power, it is necessary to consider at least 4 different entities of the present Russian state. The first is the Defense Intelligence Agency, GRU. The second is the military. The third is the State Security Agency, or Counterintelligence Agency, FSB. And the fourth is President Vladimir Putin himself. The GRU played an important role in Wagner's origin, in connection with the tumultuous reforms it underwent in the late 2000s and early 2010s. Under Shoigu's predecessor, Anatoly Suryukov, who served as defense minister from 2007 to 2012, the ministry tried to reduce the role of GRU in the military. However, after taking the role, Minister Shoigu changed course and put new resources into GRU. As a result, the agency was replenished with new personnel, many of whom were recruited from the Spetsnaz, the military's special forces traditionally overseen by the GRU. From the generals running GRU, adding Spetsnaz to the service was deliberate. The Russian military then participated in many conflicts, such as in Syria, stabilizing the Crimea Peninsula and eastern Ukraine. GRU wanted to shift its focus to what it called active intelligence operations. That means carrying out armed operations rather than simply exploiting sources, as in traditional espionage. In following years, this Spetsnaz spirit grew from within the GRU. General Vladimir Alexeyev, who was in charge of Spetsnaz, was promoted to first deputy director of the GRU. The report about Wagner's existence and activities first released in 2015. St. Petersburg-based news site frontanka.ru said that the change in GRU's operational priorities has led to Wagner's birth. Since its birth, Wagner has been active in eastern Ukraine. Dmitry Utkin, who was one of Spetsnaz's commanders, was in charge of Wagner's military operations. A few months after Wagner's existence was reported, an official in GRU also confirmed the existence of a new division within the GRU, in charge of overseeing the activities of private military groups. This new division was also led by Spetsnaz veterans. For GRU, Wagner is a front for operations, at a time when Russia denies having direct involvement in eastern Ukraine. On the surface, the use of private military companies increasingly relevant to a new paradigm of warfare in the 21st century. Private military companies such as Blackwater were used by the United States in Iraq. Wagner has many similarities with Blackwater. For the GRU, Wagner is also a continuation of a long tradition from Soviet era, when the Kremlin used proxy forces to intervene in conflicts around the world. A GRU official admitted in 2017 that Soviet intelligence was involved in the Spanish Civil War through secret private forces. Although the Soviet government never officially confirmed its involvement, Marshal Stalin sent military advisors to assist Republican forces in Spain fighting with pro-fascist Franco dictator during the 1930s. The Soviet soldiers sent out had fake names that sounded like Spanish. One of these military advisors was legendary Soviet officer Haji Mansurov, who was known in Spain as Colonel Santi, and may have been one of the archetypes for Robert Jordan character in the famous novel For Whom the Bell Tolls, written by Ernest Hemingway. For GRU, experience in the Spanish Civil War led to the birth of Wagner forces in Ukraine, where the Kremlin asserted that it was once again fighting pro-fascists. Wagner even has his own Colonel Santi, Dmitry Utkin, who has made many glorious feats in Syria and Africa. A much more complicated question is the extension of Wagner's support to the Russian military and FSB. In the early years since its emergence, and especially since the current war in Ukraine broke out, Wagner's military activities have grown significantly. They started as a secret proxy mercenary force, gradually growing into a large military unit with operations in several countries. They even have their own artillery and air force units. Wagner also has huge recruitment billboards on the streets of Russia, movie productions honoring soldiers, and a large tower in St. Petersburg where its headquarters are located. As Prigozhin increasingly criticizes the Russian military leadership, many observers have begun to question how long will this relationship last. For now, GRU still maintains its support for Wagner. GRU seems to believe that Wagner is still a great use to them. However, according to some experts, the support of GRU is not enough to be a guarantee for Wagner's Prigozhin. During Putin's presidency, there have been notable events when the support of GRU has not influenced much. For example, in the early years of this century, GRU and Spetsnaz were behind a proxy battalion in Chechnya called Vostok. The Vostok battalion was run by Ruslan Yamadayev, a powerful Georgian warlord. Vostok fought very effectively. Yamadayev was also loyal to the GRU. However, that was not enough to protect him when there was an open conflict with General Ramzan Kadyrov, the president of Chechnya. In September 2008, Yamadayev was assassinated while driving at a traffic light just a few hundred meters from the Russian government headquarters. Many people believed that the incident was carried out by forces under General Kadyrov. Until now, Boss Wagner still has support from the military, despite his harsh criticisms to Defense Secretary. Since September 2022, when Moscow lost most of its controlled territory in northeastern Ukraine, Prigozhin has publicly criticized the decision-making system of the Russian Defense Ministry. However, Russian-controlled media and even military war correspondents were ordered to help promote Wagner's activities in Ukraine. Many state newspapers continue to publish interviews with Wagner's officers, praising their fighting spirit. Even now, the level of support from Russian media for Wagner has not diminished. In fact, the Russian military continued to support Wagner. According to Prigozhin, after releasing a video of walking around the bodies of Wagner soldiers to the public, the Russian military leadership assigned General Sergei Shoigu, a former Russian commander in Ukraine, now deputy commander of Special Military Operation, a respected man in military circles, tasked with overseeing the supply of ammunition to Wagner. For Prigozhin, one advantage is that besides him, no one knows who Wagner has, so the Russian military leadership does not see the dominance of Wagner's image. Although Prigozhin constantly praised his fighters as the most capable and bravest fighting force of the Russian side, he also tried his best to keep the names of the officers and commanders in secret. None of them, including the legendary Utkin, appeared in the Russian media. When Wagner soldiers and officers were interviewed by journalists, they also remained anonymous. Another important factor to Wagner's activities is a sense of FSB, the most powerful intelligence and counterintelligence agency in Russia. After the initial mistakes of incorrectly predicting the situation in Ukraine, FSB is regaining its footing and influence. FSB has become increasingly assertive in cracking down on dissident movements. They are also active in Ukraine, detecting and disabling many secret organizations of Ukrainian intelligence. However, sabotage explosions targeting Russian logistics bases in controlled regions, such as Mariupol or Melitopol, continued to occur. Even Russian territory is inexplicably attacked more and more. This puts FSB with a heavy task, which is to capture the deep-seated reconnaissance groups of Ukrainian secret agencies. The outcome of Russia's special military operation will largely depend on this shadow intelligence war. According to some experts, the most important factor that helps Prigozhin and Wagner continue to play an important role in Ukraine is President Vladimir Putin. Prigozhin's repeated criticisms of the military leadership are so severe that many believe that only President Putin has the power to balance all parties. In fact, the Kremlin also needs Prigozhin and the Wagner Group for different purposes. Wagner's role also involves a complex tie between President Putin and the Russian military. During his early years in power, one of Putin's biggest challenges was controlling the military. The Russian armed forces are among the biggest in the world, in the largest country in the world, where every decision can be made in secret. That is why the Russian military has a tradition of ensuring the outside world knows as little about its activities as possible. This means the usual forms of surveillance in Western society, for example through parliament, law enforcement, or media, simply do not apply in Russia. During his first decade in power, Putin sought to control the military by appointing former KGB officer, close friend and intelligence colleague, General Sergei Ivanov, as defense minister. But the Kremlin boss was forced to replace General Ivanov in 2007 when efforts to reform the army in a more efficient and elite way failed. The current Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu is also an outsider of the military and is expected to help President Putin achieve unfinished goals. But now, after more than a year of war in Ukraine, there is little evidence that Putin has had more success with Shoigu than his predecessor, Sergei Ivanov. President Putin understands in times of war, the military tends to gain more power. The longer the war, the more this power grows and becomes harder to control. As a result, President Putin may have used increasingly unorthodox methods to contain the generals. For example, from the fall of 2022, he encouraged military journalists to publicize some issues in the army. But most importantly is Wagner's role as a force operating in tandem with the military in Ukrainian war. With a special position loosely governed by the GRU, a peaceful attitude from military factions, and protected by President Putin, Prigozhin hopes to build on his achievements. More importantly, Wagner is still showing its effectiveness in Ukrainian war. Wagner soldiers, mostly prisoners with no choice but to fight for their freedom, have shown more discipline and bravery than regular Russian soldiers. These soldiers, when killed, are not counted as Russian soldiers, so it is possible to keep the casualties of the Russian forces low without causing disturbance in society. Evidence from the battlefield recently has shown that the longer conflict, the lower morale of Russian soldiers. Situation in Bakhmut during the first half of May 2023 clearly illustrates this unresolved issue. Many units quickly abandoned their positions as Ukrainian forces closed in. Ukraine is gradually capturing the north of Bakhmut. This is an image contrary to the tradition of the Russian military when fighting against an enemy many times stronger, for example the Mongol army, the French army of Napoleon, the Swedish army, the Ottoman army of the German army. In these fierce battles, the bravery of the soldier, even though sacrificed himself but did not leave his position, was the biggest reason for Russia to achieve a positive result in the entire conflict. This spirit is being seen less and less during the war in Ukraine. That might be why the Kremlin still needs Wagner's force. And that has come to an end of our program today. Thank you for watching and see you next time.